is there a risk then that reading between the lines of what you were saying, that the sort of old world, if you like, where people like us come from, the old capitalist world, if you like, are trying to impose a sort of political model on what's happening now because they feel it works for them, but in effect it's really a form of intellectual colonialism, isn't it? Is that the mistake we're making?
There is apparently this sort of consciousness among many of us in this region and in the Muslim world that use this sort of bogey about Western imperialism. I don't necessarily share the view, because I think finally it's for us to decide. I don't think we need to be apologetic to the fact that we must support a system that accepts market economy. But we also have to acknowledge of the excesses in the Western system. And I refer to the issue of complicity between the big conglomerates and the political elite. So if you engage in the discourse among yourselves, this is a universal construct. I mean, I think we should learn enough from Islam, from the West, from the East, and I don't have too many problems because of that. There's a danger there, Melanie. I sense that, because a lot of us in the region would use always the excuse of Western excesses to cover the stench in their own backyard. Look at the issue of Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib prison has been publicized totally all the media in the Muslim world. I acknowledge these are excesses, unacceptable, like the burning of the Quran and the shooting in Afghanistan. But mind you, the excesses perpetrated by Arab or Muslim leaders and the plight and condition in their prison is equally, if not worse, to let us have a morally constant, consistent moral principle here. You attack America for the excesses, you should also continue to remind the leaders in the Middle East and in the Muslim world they cannot commit similar excesses.
Is there a model, though, that they themselves are looking for some way forward, a framework for the future, not having, as you say, slavery to borrow even from Tocqueville or from modern Western models, to actually create their own? Is there a template, looking around the world today, is there a template they can borrow from and say, yeah, that could work for us?
I think a more open view on this, because I don't think we can necessarily adopt a particular system for any given country. So I think the Tunisian model of then trying to build a consensus to decide on their own new constitution, or the Egyptian model then now trying to craft their own constitution. And you know, the experts, including the Supreme Court, the former Supreme Court chiefs in America say you should learn probably from Canada and South Africa, certainly not the American Constitution. But the parameters, the principles of freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the rule of law, an independent commission to combat corruption, issue of gender equality, issue of growth, to promote growth and propel growth at the same time, to be strong on the issue of distributive justice or affirmative action. These parameters must be spelled out very clearly. I see as a Muslim consistent to the ideals of the maqasid of the Sharia, not the narrow, obsolete interpretation of the Sharia promoted by some quarters. But you look at the framework, then it gels. It seems to conform with some of the ideals mentioned, Jeffersonian ideal, for example. I don't have a problem with that. But the important point is, let us then spell out the parameters. Otherwise, we'll be quarreling. Well, do you want a secular state, Islamic state, theocratic state? It is better to me, other than having quarreling over these slogans, by then stating what we mean. Can we accept a system that rejects the principle of freedom of conscience, or freedom of expression, or gender equality, or the rule of law? Our answer is categorical no. We must now formulate a new system that accepts these parameters.
So what you're saying is, I mean, you've been in and out of the political world, obviously, over the years, when you're looking at the Arab Spring, if we can call it that in shorthand terms, that they do not have the political party structures that can offer these new ways forward. They're still locked in quite traditional and, as you possibly suggest, restraint, restrictive kinds of mindset. It's
true. I mean, social networking has been, a very useful tool, but I don't necessarily ignore the importance of some of the traditional pattern or forms like the village committees and the mosque committees that do wield some influence in the traditional societies. But I think it must evolve into either viable political parties to affect an effective change or to affect change in these societies. But I think it will take time. For now, we have to contend with not only the voice of the political parties, but civil societies, and even the representative of the old order that has no evidence of being involved in the perpetrating violence or hardship to the people. I take a more tolerant view of that, because then you must build a consensus at least to decide on the parameters on the constitutional framework.
I don't know whether you'd find this a sensible question, but I'll put it to you anyway, in my ignorance, if you like. Is there a role for religion? Is there a role for Islam in the digital age?
Yes. As the extreme laicity of France is not necessarily even shared by all European countries or the United States. So to my mind, Islam for the Muslims remain very, very pertinent, very key. It is a belief system. But we have to engage and encourage its cause. Do you then take Islam as interpreted in a very dogmatic manner, or do you take it in the parameters as I referred to the higher objectives of Islam, of the Sharia? What is it for? For peace, for security, and you must spell out the principle. This is not my personal view. I think you look at some of the traditional classical scholars from Shatibi in the issue of Maqasid Sharia to some of the interpretations now, Ibn Ashur, for example, or Ibn Khaldawi in some of his views on the issue of governance, the issue of public participation. I think it's important. But here, the only difference is, I mean, I come from a multiracial, multireligious country myself. I'm leading also a coalition of Muslim, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Confucianists, animists in Malaysia. Multiracial coalition. Islam remains the base. But we draw the line. There should not be any form or attempt to compel others to accept your laws or your system. That is, I think, a very fundamental issue. And the rest must also accept the fact that in terms of personal law, in terms of some of our values, our conduct, morality and ethics, it is guided by a religious framework. But we have to draw the line, because the danger is always there when you become a bit more enthusiastic to push beyond what is considered to be permissible and infringe upon the right of the rest. We have some of these skirmishes in the past. In Malaysia, for example, when the Muslim rulers insisted that the Christians cannot use the word Allah, which to me is absolute nonsense. Here, Christians say Inshallah all the time. You mean to say if they come to Malaysia, you should charge them in court for using the word Allah? I mean, these things you will have to encounter, but then the law must be very clear and the parameters must be very clear, so that you cannot and should not ever condone any form of discrimination based on race or religion.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our panel in a moment or two, but while Dr. Ibrahim's up on the platform on his own, please feel free to stick a hand up if you want to put a question or a point of view and share it with us. Yep, if we get a microphone to this young man here, is that possible? We'll just get a microphone to you, sir. Hang on. Perhaps you could just tell us who you are as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Isa Ishaq and I come from Qatar. I am a writer, and as a writer and advocate of democracy, freedom, and social justice, first I want to congratulate you and your freedom, and to indicate that maybe your system in Malaysia have allowed you for going into some sort of judiciary that you were finally freed rather than being executed, which would have happened if you were in one of the Arab countries. But going back to the whole topic of Islam and the possibility of Islam ruling in the Arab countries, and that you've mentioned Ash-Shatibi and Ibn Ashur, who have also converted al-maqasid, maqasid al-sharia, from being an individual-based maqasid to being societal-based maqasid based on equality, al-musawah, and therefore freedom and other related topic of societal functioning rather than individual. Okay. I believe that Islam has the capacity and as its system does allow for establishing Islamic-based government. I agree with the overall principle that you, Mr. Ibrahim, have indicated. What we need in the Islamic world is to be more educated in the capabilities of what Islam provides to the societies, instead of shutting that possibility. And I also agree with you that although the West has established its own system where the society within the West has been able to be active and individuals have the right and freedom of participations, political and economical and social participation, which is missing in the most of the Muslim countries. So I think Islam is a good foundation to regenerate or to excuse me, to find a new way that would give the alternative to a political system that has been, we've seen it only in the West. I think, going back to the questions there regarding if the Muslim countries should take the West as an example and try to import the political system, the Western political system, and then implement it in the Arab Islamic world, I think that would not be successful. I think the Arab world and the Muslim world should be given the opportunity to find their own way based on their own experience, based on a good related...
Okay, we've got the point.
One word.
Okay.
One word. The Islam
I want Dr. Ibrahim to be able to respond to that.
Right. Islam is the way for salvation in the Islamic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, there's consistent with what Bellini has referred to earlier. You want to have a solution. You cannot be perceived as being dictated by the rest. That I share. And what is Islam? I mean, it's also the discourse must be dynamic and real within the Muslim society, because you have the extreme from Qaeda to the Taliban to the more progressive ideas. Because Islam without hurriya, freedom, without izzah, without karama, tolerance of the presence of non-Muslims, I mean, it's unrealistic. And without adala, without justice. So I think the whole discourse about Islam has also to change. Not to change Islam, but to bring it back to the principles. Because otherwise, it's the form that's going to take place. The form and the slogan has been killing us. It's not the substance, not justice, not equality, not respect for our women. That is now very low in its priority, but what is being propagated is the slogans, hatred, which I have to concede. I don't think it is necessarily a Western dictate. I have seen this, I've experienced this. Now we are talking about wasatiyya. It is the Americans who started praising Muslim leaders as the moderates. Never mind the corruption, Never mind the oppression, never mind the glaring difference between the rich and the poor, as long as you accept and support my war against Usama, you are wasatiyya. You are, moderate. So I think it is a problem. That's why my view is we decide the discourse, the language of discourse, not the rest. And don't blame the rest because they will have their own interests. So I share with you that yes, we have to accept the fact that Islam remains relevant. It's our faith, our values. But we will have to engage because otherwise it's scary to talk about Islam in the absence of a clear understanding. People associate only with the extremists and the fanatics and the Al-Qaeda. So, and many Muslim scholars have also acknowledged the fact that our failure, our educational system, even religious education system is a failure. It's truncated, it's obsolete, it does not even discuss the maqasid. It discussed only, for example, certain particular aspects that will excite people and clamor for extreme demands without a clear understanding of the zuruf and the waqi' and the reality and the environment. I share that concern. Thank you.
Thanks for that, and thanks for your comments, sir. If there's another hand going up there, and then we're going to move on to our panel, I think. And maybe you want to put these points to the panel as well. So just one more comment.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica South, and I represent Al Jazeera newspaper, a consultant of communications, and I'm happy to be here. Just two comments. The first comment is I've been hearing politics and I've been hearing Islam. And I would just like to suggest that, first of all, we're all human. And starting from that base, as I believe being in the middle of the two generations, the old and the new, I think we should start by being humane and understand that any kind of belief and any kind of concept has been created since the beginning of humanity. The application of this comes through the following. I think we need to learn and understand each other out of tolerance, number one. Learn to apply what we learn from others. And third, be coherent to what is actually most important for us. For example, if we're Muslim, we can always understand and learn and apply from the Western world that also includes Muslims, and so on and so forth. The other comment, which I would also appreciate very much that you give me your point of view, is the young generation, I believe, that guided by the old generation, which I call the experienced generation, should be able to create rules, regulations, and concepts that are best to be practiced in the world of today and applied in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Doctor?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely right. Look, when we talk about Islam, I compared it to what Tocqueville said about habits of the heart. And Tocqueville is a French philosopher who has a good understanding about American politics in the early ages. I talk about the need to also read Adam Smith. And I think Shakespeare, to my mind, particularly those who are familiar with English, is a required reading. So I don't share the view that you must purely confine itself to what you call as Islamic classics, because Islam, after all, is rahmatan lil alamin. Even in Hijratun Nabi, you know that the role of women, the young, and non-Muslims in the episode of Hijrah is important. And I come, as you know, as a very, very multiracial, multi-religious country. But that does not make us necessarily too apologetic to consider the relevance of our faith and our values. Because after all, what are we talking about? We are talking, when I said juxtaposition of ideas, values, is not juxtaposition with the West. It's the juxtaposition between the oppressors and the oppressed, the corrupt, and those who are clamor for reform, for good governance. And this is universal. It's a universal construct. It's Islamic in the sense that we as Muslims would be able to consider and articulate from our point of view. But it is a universal construct. That is why what's happening to Arab, some people do question why I call it Arab Spring. It is, people's uprising. It doesn't matter, but I made a similar example to Indonesia or Turkey. And it's very important too, because I'm a great fan of Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, I was with his grandson just last month talking about politics of conscience. Politics not about elections, because politics and elections have generated too many politicians who are just ruthless and corrupt in the name of democracy. And you see that in India. So he talked about conscience. Without conscience, politics will fail. And Gandhi is a Hindu. And to me, is very relevant in our entire discourse for Muslims and for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Keep the comments and questions coming, because we're going to introduce, put it to the panel in a moment. I'm going to introduce our panel, otherwise we're not going to hear from them. They're very distinguished, and we want to look forward to their contributions. Yeah, we'll come to you in a moment, sir. Yeah, absolutely. So, up on the platform, please, come and join us and show your appreciation as they come up. First up is Rami Ghouri. Good morning to you, Rami. He's a Palestinian Jordanian by background. He's a respected political columnist and author, and he's now currently director of Issam Fares Institute at the AUB in Beirut, Lebanon. You're very welcome, sir. Second up is Dr. Tariq Youssef, the leading authority on the economies of the Arab world, specialized in development issues. He's currently chief executive of Silatech in Qatar, whose goal is to work with young people to create an inclusive framework for jobs and business opportunities. So you're very welcome. Next is Abdul Rahman Al-Rashid, journalist and television executive. Good morning. General Manager at Al Arabiya Television, based here in Dubai, of course. Indeed, I often watch you in my office in London. And our final panelist this morning, very welcome, Mark Kimmitt. Many years at the top echelon of the US military community with a very strong focus on the Middle East. He's held senior posts in the US Department of State, including Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, and many, many other activities as well. So that's our panel today. And I'm going to kick off by asking you quite briefly, 2 or 3 minutes if you like, just to give us your take on this whole issue of the changing political landscape. Start with you, Rami, if you like. What is your take? And secondly, since the theme of this conference is partly to do with communications and how the journalist and communication machine covers this part of the world, it's getting it right. Are we telling the stories in the right way? Rami.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I heard your question right, what is my take on what's actually happening in this part of the world, and how has it been covered?
Yeah, how do you, well, as part of your overview, if you like, I mean, is the world, is the global communication machine, if you like, telling the story in a meaningful way?
The short answer is no. Generally, it's not. There isn't one communication machine, and I think we want, in our analysis of how the world covers us, we want to avoid the mistakes that the world makes in looking at the Middle East, which is to paint us with a single brush. I can't tell you how many times I get people ask me in interviews or meetings, what do the Arabs think about this and what do the Arabs think about that? And I reply, well, what do the world's Christians think about this, or what do Europeans think about this? There's a creeping neo-Orientalist, neo-colonialist perspective that I think is very dangerous, which is when many people in different parts of the world, especially in the West, look at our region and talk about one event, or the Arab Spring, which I think is a ludicrous title, but what I prefer to call are Arab uprisings. There's many different uprisings of different magnitudes for different reasons under different conditions of political and economic and social life, and different conditions of political legitimacy and quality of rule. They're very, very different from each other. But I think what's going on in the Arab world is the birth of the Arab citizen, the birth of politics, the birth of a new social order, and attempts to create indigenous systems that are accountable, pluralistic, representative, democratic, and above all merciful and decent, and that treat people with the same kind of decency that they expect from their own societies. And this is a long-term process. It took the Europeans 500 years to get from the Magna Carta to the French Revolution. It took the Americans 195 years to get from their Declaration of Independence to giving black people the vote in 1965. These processes take a long time. And we've just started on this road about 8 or 10 months ago. So I think what's happening in the Arab world is a momentous transformation in which citizens are finally acting like people who have rights and who have the power to influence how their societies are governed. And this is a process that is extremely exciting but extremely complex and will take a long time. And I think, broadly speaking, the Western media in particular are not capturing the nuances of what's going on. They're too preoccupied with their fear of Islamists. They're too preoccupied about what does this mean for Israel. They're too preoccupied about Iran, and they're not really focusing on the excitement of Arab people struggling and dying, and there are thousands in Libya and in Syria and other places, people struggling for the same kinds of freedom and dignity and a decent life that people in the West achieved in their struggles for liberty and democracy and pluralism. So we still have a problem, I think, with a lot of the media coverage, but the most important thing is that there is this movement that has started in the Arab world, and it's moving at a different pace in different countries, but I think this is a historic moment, and we should celebrate it.
Okay, thanks for that. Tariq, Dr. Youssef, you work with a lot of young people, of course, a very important aspect of this, gives you a particular perspective. Is there a new politics here, and what do the young people tell you?
Not an easy question, and I think one, as Rami suggested rightly, we should be paying greater attention to, and we should be also, from a PR perspective, communication, and a government perspective, investing quite a bit of resources and energies in trying to understand. It is true that these revolutions, protest movements, uprisings were led by young people, and that the agenda of the youth will be paramount, will be dominant, and as it should, shape some of the priorities in public policy, some of the priorities in the new discourse that the youth have either attached themselves to or are calling for. That is what I think we see in a number of countries that have gone through change, and also in the countries that have not gone through change. I think most governments in the Arab world at the moment are preoccupied with the challenges, the opportunities, and the constraints for empowering Arab youth. I think the challenge, especially for the countries that have gone through the revolutionary change, is in integrating the youth in the new political arena. How do you do that when most youth are still either organized along protest movements, have had very little exposure or prior experience in being in the formal political arena, where parties are just emerging, where what constitutes as acceptable public policy or unacceptable public policy has not been defined, and where, quite frankly, there are a lot of anxieties in the short term about economic volatility, job security, and the very future of these revolutions. I think the countries that are going through change are going to have a very difficult time managing, integrating a lot of these youth voices who are coming in with very heightened expectations, very strong demands, as they rightly should be. In the countries that have not succumbed to these revolutionary changes, the task is equally possibly difficult, partly because the systems as they've been designed have not necessarily been established to integrate the voices of youth or to give youth space in the public arena. Most of the time, policies that are aimed at youth are top-down. They're policies that governments manage. But amongst or within both camps, I would argue, and this is my final thought, if the Arab Spring has been about achieving goals and aspirations and dreams for a generation at least of youth in the Arab world who have felt frustrated, felt aggrieved, and felt left out, then the challenge from a public policy perspective, from a media perspective, from a social perspective, and from a citizen perspective ought to start with the following question: how do we integrate them into the political arena? How do we make their voices heard? How do we make them actual players in the process of change, as opposed to essentially either co-opt them, repress them, or hand them government gifts from time to time?
Okay, thanks for that. Mr. Al-Rashid, from the point of view of a television executive, I mean, demographics, young and old, they do come into this. I mean, the median age in Libya today is about 25, 26. Where I come from in the EU, it's probably double that. We often overlook simple things like that, which are actually quite important. How do you report these things from the street, and do these implications come into it?
Well, let me talk about my own observation and just make comparison. It was 1990 when about, I think, 12 women drove cars in Saudi Street or Riyadh Street. And it was hardly noticed except with very few people in the media. Last year, actually, is one woman drove and everybody noticed. So was it really people changed their mind, or was it, the media, or was it the new media, or was it the social network, or was it, what social changes, political changes, the discussion on different levels? Are we going to, to more kind of mass discussion over local issues, etc.? I don't know. There are so many questions. But in my opinion, obviously, we are witnessing big changes. You talk about spring. Well, this is a spring came after 50 years of drought. This is quite, it's against, science. But yes, media is part of it. But I like to claim credit as a media. Media is not really the things made the change. I mean, let me put it this way. It's actually people change things. Things have changed because they were ought to change. You can't really, things will not carry on in the streets simply because the media was not involved or involved. I don't think so, really. I think it just was, you talk about 70% of the population youth. So it will reach a point where people talk about unemployment. You're talking about women, millions of women in society graduated from colleges and schools. It's obviously they will reach a point and say, well, look, guys, we need jobs and we want to drive cars and we have an opinion to talk about. Intellectuals, they were talking about Islam and what's the Islam role and interpretation, as His Excellency was talking a few minutes ago about Islam al-Wasati. Yes, but you reach a point now people are not just the intellectuals talking about it, it's the average person now talking about what the role of Islam in their own life. So certainly we have to change. And I'd like to add as well, yes, media has changed completely. In the old days, I'm talking about only 3-4 years ago. I'm not talking about like 30 years ago. It was only a few thousand people work in the media. Today we have in this region 100 million people work in the media. Anyone carries a telephone with a camera in it is a media person. They write, they are commentators. If you write on Twitter, you are a commentator. They are good as you are, by the way. If you take pictures and send it, you are definitely a cameraman. If you speak, or if you do a YouTube, you are a producer, you are a director, you are a presenter. So we talk like about 100 million participants in this region. They are all media people. That's it.
Okay, thanks for that. And fifth, but certainly not last, Mark. Yep. Mark Kimmett, your overview, just a few points. You've had a very different perspective on all of this over your career.
Well, actually, I think that the Western perspective on what we are characterizing as the Arab Spring is probably wrong. The freedom agenda, what has been carried on by this current administration, has this mistaken ideal that somehow we've just got a bunch of Americans over here in the region that if they just were freed from their bonds, they'd be just like us. I find that to be, in many ways, simple Western chauvinism. I'm not really sure what's happening over here, but I'm pretty sure what it's not. And it's not what we think of it in the West. Now, my colleagues at Bell Pottinger and at Bates Pan Gulf have done some interesting work on seeing this not as much of a political movement as it is a psychological reaction on the part of the masses who once saw their leaders become, in the long run, simple rulers. The social contract between the leader and the led was broken and is broken. And there's a sense of betrayal, there's a sense of violation, there's a sense of abandonment. If you take the historical view and look at the numbers of political movements that have gone over the past 50 years, Baathism, Pan-Arabism, Nasserism, and those iconic leaders, those revolutionaries who came in with such promise, Mubarak, Gaddafi, Salah, Ben Ali, at the end they all went from being charismatic, iconic leaders to simply rulers who surrounded themselves by sycophants and by, in most cases, incompetent sons. So what it appears truly is that this is not a political movement as much as a psychological movement where the street, and it is not just the youth, this is throughout the age groups, are saying we want to take power away from the rulers and give it back to leaders. Leaders who will restore that trust, father figures who will restore that relationship and lead us on. I think the warning is quite simple. Communications is very important to this. Those who choose to be leaders would be wise to listen to their communications professionals, and those who simply demand to rule, quite frankly, history has already passed judgment and will pass judgment again for those rulers who choose to rule rather than those leaders who choose to lead.
Okay. Dr. Ibrahim, just a quick comment, quick thought there. Leaders became rulers. Fair? Fair comment, fair observation? Leaders became rulers in this part of the world and therefore unpopular and...
I don't think it's the fact that when you deal with autocrats and dictators in the worst form. But you know, it's interesting that the discourse in India, a viable democracy, they're talking about somewhat a similar issue, that through a democratic process, rulers becoming so autocratic and so corrupt. So the discourse is quite relevant, though it is a different level. Of course, you don't have these brutalities like inflicted by Bashar Assad towards his own people now, not that extent. But the essence of the argument is relevant.
Thanks for that. Okay, we can come back to one or two of those hands that came up earlier. If we can invite you once again to put your point of view. Yep. And please let us know who you are if you could. Thanks.
Testing. My name is Mohammed Al-Khalfan, and I'm from Saudi Arabia. I'm researching a topic, empowerment of women from home to work. And I have interviewed over hundreds females, and I addressed the question, what is the definition of empowerment of women means to you? And I came to a common denominator between all those whom I interviewed. They are just looking for opportunity. They are looking for equal rights and equal responsibilities, and etc. But the questions that I am trying to throw in this magnificent conference is, under the aggressive media that we have and the misinterpretations of the fairness of Islam toward Muslim women based on societal interpretation, what would be the good message to share and cascade and communicate to the media under the aggressive media chaos that we have in today's media? And just Abdurrahman said that the media didn't play on the Arab Spring, and I would say you need to review your comments, because as far as we know, the Facebook was behind the what we see in today's Arab world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Who wants to kick off? Rami, any thoughts? I know you're a long way away, but...
I couldn't hear the question very well. It was about what we should portray about women in Islamic countries? Was that the question?
Could you just clarify the question specifically? We're actually getting slightly muffled
I'm saying the empowerment of women is sometimes, if you look to it from a definition of viewpoint, people look to it as a power or a shifting. But the actual is empowerment means giving women equal rights as the Islam religion or any other religion gave it. But the media sometimes from different sources give different interpretations. So how we can unify or how we can clarify this to the mass population.
Okay, thanks for that. Rami, and perhaps Abdul Rahman too, if you want to have a think about that, as the guilty parties here, apparently, the media, misconstrue the whole issue of equality between the gender here. Rami, is that a fair comment?
There is a major problem in terms of the broad way in which many of the Western media talk about the Arab world as a whole and the Islamic world as well, and the issue of women is a major part of that. I think it's very hard to get into it in great detail in just a short answer, but I think we have to look at the totality of the interaction between our two societies and to try to really understand, well, what is the reason why so many Western European, North American, predominantly media institutions tend to portray the Arab world in terms of these cliches of fundamentalist religion. Anything they write about Islamic issues is related to religion. Even when they write, in the U.S. studies have been done that show the quality media in the U.S., when they write about American Muslims, everything they do is written about in the context of religion, sports and religion, food and religion, politics and religion. They don't do that for any other religion. They only do it for Islam. So there's a problem that the Western world has with dealing with Muslims and Islam and Islamic societies in the same way that they deal with Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish societies. They don't use the same criteria. There is a historical problem and there's a contemporary political problem, and it has to do with many issues, the unsatisfactory relationships in different periods of modern history, the Arab-Israeli conflict, terrorism issues, what happened to Americans in Iran, recent history. There's a whole range of problems that come from the past and from the modern world. I think the best thing for people in Arab and Islamic societies to do is to develop better quality journalism to tell the true story of our societies. We know the good things about our societies and we know the weaknesses of our societies, whether it's about women or youth or treating old people or handicapped people or minorities or whatever it is. The good and the bad is there. We have to tell the story accurately and keep working as we are doing with education and an honest assessment of our societies, and let the next generation do a better job than we have, perhaps, in portraying the total reality of our societies, not to the West or to the East, but to ourselves, most of all, to treat our own people, our own citizens, with the respect that they deserve as citizens of modern states. And this whole process of what's going on in the Arab world, I disagree with the comment Mr. Kins made about leadership. It's not really about leadership. It's about citizens. It's about human beings who have rights as citizens, and they want to do more than just be consumers. They want to be citizens with rights and opportunities to help shape their societies and to enjoy the benefits of good governance. So I think we can tell that story in a better way, and then it'll get projected.
Okay. Abdul Rahman, you might find this a tricky question, I'm not sure, but certainly in Europe and in the UK, we've watched with interest, fascination, the growth of modern media in the Arab world, Al Arabiya, yourselves, Al Jazeera, and so on. And indeed, my daily schedule is to watch those channels in English and so on and learn a little bit more. But what do you instruct, coming down in practical terms about dealing with this whole gender issue and differences in rights between gender, what do you instruct your journalists to do when it comes to portraying in your program material that particular issue?
Well, of course, the basic issues for all journalists are trained to, they search for information, they try to be factual, they try to be, bring all the stories, not really just being fair. I think this is good to say, but also it's good television when you have all the information, when you have all the sides on the screen. But as you see, we are in the Arab world right now. I just to mention one thing, a little bit probably not shocking, it's not surprising, and people been living with this fact for a long time. Who are the bad guys today? The bad guys are called Bashar al-Assad, for example, another bad guy called Hassan Nasrallah, another bad guy called Colonel Gaddafi, another bad guy called Ali Saleh of Yemen, etc. These actually were the celebrities. They were the heroes only just before 2011. So if you were sitting here just 13 months ago, I think you would have completely had different arguments or different, characterization. So was that the media, or was it the people in the street, or was it, the false information? I don't know where it came from. But the fact is, if you go around now the streets and the Arab streets, actually, you will have I'm not going to say but for sure, but almost consensus on this matter. Almost everybody will think of these names I mentioned are the bad guys. If you were going in the streets, 2 years ago, probably these guys were the top 5 best Arab leaders. I don't know what to say, but it explains itself.
Yeah. I mean, as an on and off journalist myself over many years with BBC and Sky and all the rest of it, we reckon we're storytellers, and stories tend to have good guys and bad guys, and when you really analyze what current affairs news journalism is about, it's often about conflict, isn't it? And Mark, may I put this to you because you're an American. There's a saying in the news media in the United States, if it bleeds, it leads.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see so much of not only the Arab Spring in television, but we also see the situations in Afghanistan and the tragic incidents of the last few days. The fact remains that much of the perceptions of our citizens, whether in this region or back in the United States, is shaped through the filter of the media. I'm part of that as well, and that's why I think, as has been said so eloquently up here, and was said in the first session, truth well told ought to be on top of everybody's camera as it's pointing at you for that interview. It is unfortunate that it is not only news, but it is a business. So we understand the balance that needs to be struck between the sensationalism and the story. I think most of us on the consuming end would like a little more analysis, would like a little more depth, would like a little less blood. But again, that's the nature of the beast, that's the nature of the business, and I don't think we're going to be changing that anytime soon, and certainly not in this conference.
Yeah. Perhaps turn the coin over very briefly, Dr. Youssef. We've looked at young people, we've looked at the Arab Spring, which I guess when you look on TV coverage and media coverage, they're all young people, many young men, are they not? And you deal with them in a practical way on a daily basis. The one thing I see as a viewer is the anger, the fury. Are they all angry, the people you deal with?
I think they're angry, and they should be angry. And I think if they weren't angry, we would not have seen the change we did in Tunis, in Cairo, and in Tripoli. I'm of the mind, and I will repeat what I've said before, on the Arab Spring, the Arab revolutions, the Arab awakening, that it was driven to a great extent by a sense of fulfilled expectations, a sense of failure, a sense of disappointment, a sense of utter loss at not issues that have to do with Islam or the West, not being given opportunities to empower themselves. I think we're speaking about a lot of very practical things that we know very well here that matter to young people, men and women, Muslim and Christian, Arab and other, in this part of the world. It's about jobs, it's about education, it's about housing, it's about marriage. And in the last decade, it became increasingly about inequality, corruption, as Dr. Anwar suggested, a very unhealthy marriage between business and government, about cronyism, I think in the face of that unfairness in the landscape of opportunity, with no voice or ability to articulate your message or to even express your concern and frustration, it made perfect sense, I think, for the anger to accumulate and for that anger to express itself in the bloody terms we observed most recently in some other countries. So it is about anger, but I think that anger also goes hand in hand with aspirations and dreams and hopes for a better future. And I think that is the challenge we face now. How do you channel that energy? Through public policy, through change, through the media, through the new political landscape, to empower young people, but to also give them a chance to become the citizens that Rami had suggested earlier. I think this is a core challenge that unites the Arab world, but especially in the countries that have gone through change, where expectations at the moment by these young people are incredibly high, and lack of patience with what they see to be continued failure or continued practices from the old regimes is also quite present. I think this is a core challenge, and I'd say not just for the young people, it's a core challenge for us as societies at this moment. Demographically, democratically, the numbers on the sides of young people, the aspirations, their dreams, their social media, their education, and quite frankly, the opportunities that they bring also to us as societies for growth, for development, for transformation of a lot of things. This is where the discussion ought to be. I say this with reference earlier to what I think to be an obsessiveness at times with questions that have to do with Islam and women or Islam and the West or how people see us. I think the Arab Spring from a public policy perspective is about us doing for ourselves what we should be doing. And it's about us taking this opportunity now to focus on our own internal issues. At least for once in 50 years, in a number of countries, the people can in fact decide the course of change, the modalities of change, given a huge set of challenges and a track record of failure over at least 2 decades.
Mark Kemet, Tarek mentioned the word dream there. You have the American dream. Is that something that can be implanted elsewhere in other cultures?
Well, what's remarkable is the same sense of anger. In fact, it's even deeper than anger. It's a sense of betrayal. It's a sense of disrespect. That is not only being found in this part of the world, in what we call the Arab Spring, but it's that same manifestation that we see inside of America by the 99. That same sense of betrayal, that same sense of disrespect, that this link between the leader and the led is broken. These young people have very different circumstances in America. They have the very same tools, but they have very different circumstances. They thought they were going to emerge from college, go into a job, become part of society, and have that same American dream that had been granted to their fathers, their forefathers, and their forefathers before them. And this, what you're seeing, this betrayal inside and on the streets of the United States, that's where it's very similar. Can you transplant the American dream over here? No. The American dream is uniquely American. But there is a different dream and a different aspiration for people in this region, culturally consistent with their past and their future. But to suggest that the young children, the young adults of any society don't have a dream to aspire to, whatever that dream is, they certainly have it, they certainly deserve it, and in many ways what we're seeing on the streets today is a betrayal of the opportunity for that dream, whether in and outside of Wall Street or on Tahrir Square.
Okay. Plenty of questions. Let's take one more, and then we're going to be really democratic, and we're going to use this amazing tool of democracy here and ask you to vote on one or two interesting questions, and we'll get all of you to discuss them further. Right. Have anyone on this side of the room? Because we've all been over here. Sir, in the front. You're on the team, Chris. You can't ask questions. Huh? This young fella here on the aisle. Chris is on our panel tomorrow, so I wonder if he's
my name is
gonna be able to
Abdurrahman Al
start. Anyway,
Hussein. I'm from Saudi Arabia. It's really very interesting listening throughout the various addresses and speeches by prominent speakers. It's very amazing to hear that religious, plays a very important role in this. And if you really look back at other nations and other, especially in the Arab countries, it's not the Arab Spring, it's the awakening. We've been hibernating for many years. We've been patient enough. Patience have run out. People are coming forward because the life that they're facing is really putting a lot of burden on them because they are young, they want their basic needs and requirements. Besides that, people are drifting away from being honest, straightforward, from being tasked with a certain leadership which they have felt incompetent over years. And they've been sitting in their positions, leading and making decisions when there is an expiration date for everything. So again, I really like the idea that religion can play a big role in this. Because if you are honest, if you have what the foundation is built on a strong values, I think people will rise up to it, and they can do whatever they can do best, and then they can leave their post and give it to somebody else who can take the lead further. That's my comment.
Okay, I think you're really addressing Rami's original point there, that we are seeing the birth of the Arab citizen, apart from anything else, and all that implies. So thanks for your contribution. Yeah, can we get a microphone down to the front here, this young chap here, please? There's so many of you, I don't know whether we're going to fit you all in, but we'll try.
Assalamu alaikum. Sorry for speaking in Arabic, because it's the language of my country. Assalamu alaikum. تعليقي على ما طرح الدكتور طارق قبل 5 سنوات كان في مؤتمر في أبو ظبي شاركت فيه أنا شخصيا وطرحت أرقام وإحصائيات عن واقع الوطن العربي ويقولون نحن أمة لا تقرأ وإذا قرأت لا تفهم. أنا ضد هذه العبارة، ولكن طرحت أرقام وإحصائيات عن واقع البطالة في الوطن العربي وسألت هذا التساؤل من بعد طرح الإحصائيات ماذا نتوقع من بعد الأرقام المخيفة كانت 21% نسبة البطالة بين الشباب. وقبل 4 شهور كان في مؤتمر المسؤولية الاجتماعية نظم مجلس الرياض للمسؤولية الاجتماعية والأستاذ عسكر الحارثي موجود ما بيننا هنا، وطرحت أيضا أنا شخصيا في هذا المؤتمر بالقاهرة أنه إذا لم تتحرك المؤسسات العربية الآن وبشكل عاجل لإيجاد برامج واقعية تلامس احتياجات الإنسان العربي أينما وجد، فستتحرك الجماهير العربية مثل ما تحركت لتغيير الأنظمة ستتحرك إلى احتلال البورصات العربية كلها. سؤالي أو تعليقي بالتحديد، أنا أتصور أن الأزمة الحقيقية، وبحكم اختصاصي دكتوراه في العلاقات العامة والاتصال ومدرب معتمد في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة في أغلب المؤسسات الحكومية، أتصور وتشخيصي الشخصي أن الأزمة العربية حقيقتها غياب أجهزة علاقات عامة قوية وفاعلة تمارس بناء على المفهوم الحديث الذي طرحه السيد جيمس جرونيك. فنحن ما زلنا نمارس العلاقات العامة بناء على النموذج الأول، بينما هناك 4 نماذج طرحها السيد جيمس جرونيك. ألم يأتي الوقت لأهل العلاقات العامة للاطلاع على نموذج الإمارات العربية المتحدة؟ دولة الإمارات نموذج ناجح في مجال إدارة الاتصال الحكومي المسمى غير، ولكن هي أجهزة علاقات عامة حقيقية وفاعلة. لو نظرنا إلى المجتمع العربي حوالينا كله يعاني مشاكل وأزمات، ولكن استطاعت أجهزة العلاقات العامة ممثلة في الاتصال الحكومي بتلامس احتياجات الإنسان الإماراتي والاستجابة لمثل هذه الاحتياجات. وشكرا.
Very, very important contribution. Thank you very much for that. In fact, with time pressures, perhaps we should push that into the afternoon session, because it's exactly really what our speaker and distinguished panel will look at, after lunch. The whole issue of what PR professionals can do to accommodate these shifts and these changes. And I think you rightly point out that there is a viewpoint that the PR profession in this part of the world has to catch up with all these new realities. So if anyone wants to comment on that on the panel, I'll quite happily take it. But also, I think we should also raise that this afternoon when Tim Bell, Lord Bell, is going to be offering his viewpoints, and of course the panelists themselves. Anyone want to come in on that? It's a slightly professional observation, if you like, I want you to make, because none of you are really PR specialists, but are you? No. Perhaps I'm going to ask Abdul Rahman just briefly then, as Arabia. Do you reckon it's a difficult message to get across, Abdul Rahman, that you are living in new times, and that the whole equation has to be shifted around a bit more to interpret what the Arab Spring means in terms of citizenship, in terms of what people want? Do you think you're up with the curve, or behind it, or in front of it? And where is public opinion? Is it by you, or is it behind you, or is it parallel, if you like? Yeah. I mean, it's something you must face every day. Are we speaking into a void, if you like, as a broadcaster?
I'm really avoiding lecturing, about PR to PR specialists. Obviously, I would not lecture you guys about PR. I'm from the last one. I like the PR creatures more than the lawyers, but I mean, still, it doesn't work. Anyhow, but look, we are living in an age right now of great debate. This is really great debate what we are seeing right now. Personally, I don't believe in numbers. When someone comes to me telling me that we have 15% unemployment, it's not really true. And I challenge any of the governments really who have correct information about unemployment in their own countries. Really, they don't have it. They don't have the means to know who is living in their own society, how many people live there. They don't even know, they don't have records who has jobs, who do not have jobs. It's really a fact. I can challenge any of the ones who have numbers saying, I'm talking about, countries with the big population. You cannot really say unemployment, how with the PR companies now, or the PR officers, they can really portray different pictures or trying to communicate between different groups. I just think, we have problems definitely of, we are debating issues right now, and unfortunately numbers are not very much accurate. This is my understanding.
Sure.
Yeah.
What I'm talking is about these numbers are real indicators for what's going to happen. So if we're having a very vital public relation department would study the needs and suggested to the زين بن عابدين said أنا فهمتكم متأخر، لكن لو كان في جهاز علاقات عامة قوي على المستوى الحكومي لأعطى هذه الاستجابة إلى زين العابدين بدري قبل سنوات واستجاب ببعض الإجراءات والإصلاحات. وشكرا.
But I agree with you. I'm saying you need correct information to make accurate assessment, to make good PR as well. So yeah, this is my understanding.
Okay, I'm sure we'll raise that in the session this afternoon. It's a very, very valuable point. Right. Just, I did promise you a little bit of an opportunity for you to intervene as a group of delegates, and by way of voting on our survey. So I hope you want to collaborate on this. First, you will have to have this piece of equipment. Looks like something you use at home to change the television channels, in which case many of you might need a 10-year-old child to come and help, I'm not sure. But it has numbers on it, as you can see. And Bolach, if you can, we'll have the first slide up now. And what you do is simply look at the question posed on the screen and vote as appropriate. You have, in this particular case, will current regional international protest movements continue beyond 2012? Yes, no, or don't know. That's 1, 2, and 3. And please vote now. The red pie chart is simply telling us that the computer is digesting the results, and we should have a viewpoint in a moment or two. Okay, I think it's quite interesting. So we'll do a couple more. We could have a lot more. We'll do some later in the day and tomorrow as well. So moving on, Bolash, to slide question number 2. Have governments become more transparent in the wake of the Arab Spring and global protest movements? Again, it's 1, 2 and 3. Yes, no, or don't know. Please vote now. We're running bets up here, by the way. I'm not sure if that's allowed.
75 for 2.
That's interesting. It's a mixed bag of countries.
Yes, okay, slightly. Is it contradictory? I don't know. We'll do one more. We'll get plenty of time later on to do some of the others, but I think it's a fascinating exercise. Okay, well, let's just move finally to that third. Let's have a look. Which one? Okay, how important is social media like Facebook and Twitter? We'll be looking at this a lot more later on, of course, as well, but very important. How important is social media like Facebook, Twitter and the rest to protest movements? You have 4 options here. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Very important, somewhat important, not at all important, don't know. Okay, please vote now. Probably a bit of a no-brainer, this one, to be honest. Okay, certainly everyone has a viewpoint on that because there were 0 don't knows, which I think is quite an interesting idea. Okay, more comments and questions, but first maybe, again, coming back to our broadcasters, perhaps Rami, because it's unfair to keep picking on Abdul Rahman, but, you know, Rami, when you kind of write your political comments and so on, are you looking at sort of the Twitter flow, if you like? Is it important, all this social media traffic, given that it's unregulated, given that they're citizen journalists and aren't necessarily as good as you as a real one, if you like? Do you take it all seriously?
I think the social media is quite significant at a very specific, brief moment in time in most of these revolutions. Or these uprisings. There's no doubt about it that Twitter and Facebook and cell phones and internet and other things had a very important but very, very brief moment of importance in Tunisia and Egypt. You see today in Syria and Yemen and Bahrain, they play a different role. They're now providers of raw footage of film, video, and eyewitness testimonies. Skype now is equally important. So they do have some importance, but I think it's important to keep in mind one thing. If we're talking about social media as a communication tool that sparks a revolution, let's give credit to the first really important social media in the modern world, which was Paul Revere's horse. Paul Revere, who rode his horse and told the Americans that the British were coming and sparked the American Revolution. When we look back on the American Revolution, we don't talk about Paul Revere's horse, we talk about Paul Revere. We talk about the American patriots who fought for their freedom. And in the Arab world, we shouldn't be talking about Twitter and Facebook. We should be talking about Mahmoud and Salwa and Muhammad and Ahmed and the people who use these media. So the media are simply a tool. They're a tool that people use. And it's important to keep the balance. And I think what I said in the beginning, there is this danger of a kind of neo-colonial interpretation. I mean, for people in the early stages of these movements to call them the Twitter revolution and the Facebook revolution, I thought was really insulting, because people were hesitant in the West to look at people in the Arab world and say, these are patriots, these are citizens, these are people who love their country and they want to make it the best country possible. They want their country and their public policy and their government to reflect the values that they feel as Arabs and as Muslims and as citizens of Libya and Syria and Egypt and Tunis and every other country in this region. So we have to be really careful how we analyze the social media to give them the importance that they have as tools of communication in certain moments of catalytic change, but not to allow them to hide the much more important issue of the sheer courage, determination, and high values of individual men and women who want to bring about the well-being for them and their societies that is really the big story.
Okay, I think it's an important issue actually, so let's put this to all the members on the panel now. So perhaps I'll just go along quickly. Dr. Youssef, Tariq, not so much as a development specialist here, but as a citizen, do you see this as important? And the point that Ram is making is that there's a risk that Facebook could become faceless. In other words, it is about individuals, is it not? And we've got to address those concerns more than simply the mass movement of 600 or 700 million people, which is what Facebook's all around these days.
I cannot disagree with your assumption or what Rami has just suggested. I'm a public policy analyst. I think the revolutions that took place or the need for change that will take place in other countries has to be embodied in actual public policy changes, things that matter to people. And when that happens, the social media will reflect. And when that doesn't happen, the social media will protest. So I do subscribe to some extent to the notion Rami suggested that in fact social media is in many ways a tool, an instrument, a vehicle that gets deployed for different purposes at different moments. I do credit, for example, in a number of countries, and I'll say Libya because I know more about it. In Libya, the timing, the date, the revolution was set by activists in the social media space. There's absolutely no doubt about that from the perspective of those who witnessed it and those who have participated in it. Social media played an incredibly important role in galvanizing, in mobilizing, in energizing, in focusing public attention on a specific concern at a specific moment in time. Social media today in the very same country, Libya, serves a very different purpose. It's an instrument of protest. It's an instrument of political opinion making. It's actually an instrument that is serving increasingly to fragment public opinion and to fragment the collective action and the ability of youth, for example, to do something together as a group. Because everyone has their own Facebook page, everyone has their own Twitter account, and you're seeing groupies emerge in a very weakened political structure to begin with, making it further weak. Without perhaps prejudicing where this discussion would go, I think we can acknowledge the importance, the role, and at this particular moment, the centrality of technology and media and public relations in shaping events. But we should never also lose sight of the fact that ultimately you need to have policy on the ground. You need to have change. There isn't any amount of social media or PR effort that will cover for consistent, systematic public sector failure. And I think it would be a mistake to view public relations from that perspective. I think we need to get back with social media, and governments can also be a participant in this, an actor, to the business of serving our societies through governments, through civil society organizations, and through all other structures that matter for the things that Rami and Dr. Anwar spoke about earlier, and Akh Abdurrahman, citizenship, responsibility, public service, jobs, corruption, all of these things.
Okay, but Dr. Ibrahim, you've been sitting there very patiently, listening to all of this. This session has been about the political landscape. We're trying to judge it, are we not, and analyze it while we're in the middle of it. Historians in the future, 50 or 100 years' time, will look back at this. What will they focus on, do you think? At the one end, you have a young fruit seller in a town in Tunisia, and at the other, you have the might of the Facebooks and the great technology channels that we have today. What do you think their judgment will be on how all this started and where it went?
Let me begin by personal experience. I was in prison in 1998. And in the absence of a free media in Malaysia, the only alternative is a social network. There was no Facebook or Twitter at that time, but there were blogs and internet access. And if you look at the development in 1998, Malaysia registers the highest growth of internet penetration anywhere in the world, purely because people just want to know. They went to the alternative media. So it has, to my mind, historically, I mean, not a personal point aside, a major phenomenal change in how people view and became extremely cynical about the government-controlled media as a tool for those in power. But then, now, looking back, you find this level of sophistication, as Rami and Tariq has been stating, because those in power are also more sophisticated now. They have public relations consultants, with respect to many of you. They have now employed a vast number of officers now using the same weapon through Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and internet access to then try and diffuse or stem this new wave or time. So it's not as simple as, you know, what was genuinely an effort in the initial period, like the uprising in the Middle East. I'm sure those who are now trying to counter these efforts would also use the same tool. But notwithstanding this, I would still consider this social network is still, looking back, in terms of public awareness, public education, and more important, public participation, the most phenomenal, the most effective means of reaching out and expressing, it's an expression of the people in clamoring for reform and change. And to me now, I happen to be leader of opposition in Malaysia. I don't have 1 minute of airtime on any media, television, radio, or national media, but I will have millions of people going to the YouTube to listen to the speech, possibly even this exchange, and Twitter and the Facebook. So it is still a major tool to impact change in our societies.
Okay, thanks for that. Abdul Rahman, just a final comment on this session from you then. In that poll, something like 95% of those who responded in that poll there said that social media like Facebook are either very important or somewhat important. In other words, 95%, more or less, all of them. Has it changed the way that you have to report the news?
Yes, of course. There is so much fierce competition, crowded market, if we call it market, obviously. It's true, but we all know, obviously, when I said, and I think my colleagues here, the panelists, say the same thing, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, etc., who made the changes in the street or the public participation, as Mr. Ibrahim said. It actually came from the Facebook and Twitter. Because old media has been there for a long time. Old media was watched, television and radios and newspapers were read in Tunisia and Egypt in the past 50 years, and people did not go in the street and protest and change governments. So obviously it's not us. This is what I'm saying. We have new tools. We have definitely new dynamics in our politics and in our, society. And we are the old media. We are obviously we are evolving in it. We have about more than 1.6 million people in our Facebook account, for example. We have about 20 accounts now. So it's quite an important thing for us, because Facebook, Twitter, and the others, YouTube, actually becoming tools for us to alert the public to watch television. This is quite, the change, or the changes are taking place. As well as Twitter and Facebook are becoming the source of information for us. YouTube, actually, we live on YouTube. We started this experience about 3 years ago in Iran. When the uprising happened in Iran, we started using the YouTube heavily The same thing now, we live literally on YouTube, videos and pictures coming from Syria and other, kind of revolutions in the region. So yes, we actually now, there is some sort of integration, there is some sort of kind of, we are working together, and I believe this is how we survived. The dinosaurs can make it this time.
Okay, thanks for that. And a final comment then from Mark Kimmett, because I'm afraid the clock's always against us in this sort of session. One of the, and I'll put it this way, Mark, one of the questions we did not ask you in the poll, in the survey a moment ago, because we had got no time, was this one, and I'll put it to you, Mark, by way of closing this session. Here's the question. Will the Arab Spring lead to long-term change in the Middle East? You can either say yes, no, or don't know, but you can give us maybe another minute if you like.
Well, I think the answer is yes, and to tie this all together, in many ways, the anger, betrayal, resentment felt on the part of the youth, accelerated by the catalysts of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, is going to bring about profound change. Now, that change could be good, that change for people such as Bashar al-Assad may not be so good, but there will be change. We're seeing it already. And it's very little doubt that the tools of Facebook, I mean, just take a look at what's the most popular YouTube video right now? Kony 2012, talking about the Lord's Resistance Army, what's happening in Africa among Joseph Kony. These tools have had already demonstrated they have the capability to accelerate change. And as I said earlier, I think rulers that will want to continue to rule and try to turn back the tide of time won't be ruling much longer. Leaders who listen to their people, listen to what the voices are saying, listen to the Twitter, the Facebook, the YouTube, and understand what the led are asking for are the ones that will reform, will change, and both Wall Street and the Arab Street are going to be better because of it.
Okay. You heard it here first. Ladies and gentlemen, wonderful panel. Great keynote address from Dr. Anwar Ibrahim. Thanks for that and for sharing your wisdom with us today, sir. And the rest of our panel, in no particular order, Abdul Rahman Al-Rashid, Dr. Tariq Youssef, Mark Kimmett on my right here, and Rami Khoury. Thank you very much for joining us today.